Okay, so we are picking back up in chapter 12, verse 1, the great wonder that appears in heaven. And there are two of them. 12:1 and 2 lists the first. 12:3 and 4 lists the second. It is at this point in the book of Revelation that we really start to see where the battle is headed. The first wonder, if you read it with me in 12:1, it says, "There appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, upon her head a crown of 12 stars." This is what John is seeing in the vision. "And she," this woman, "is with child, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered." The second, it says in 3, is there's another wonder in heaven, a great red dragon. And this becomes significant in the next chapter. We'll get to it in just a moment. It says this great red dragon had 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And you can see this great red dragon coming against the woman. And it says in 12:4 that the dragon took his tail and drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. The woman brings forth a child. The dragon takes his tail and he gathers the third part of the stars, and he begins to attack the woman and the child as the woman conceives and brings birth to this child. It seems to me that the woman is the righteous remnant of God's people. It's not exclusively the Old Testament Israeli people, but it's not exclusively the church either. It is the entire idea of the righteous people of God, whether under the Old Testament or the New Testament. It's both. It's just the righteous remnant. I'll just reference a couple of passages and you can look at these in your own time. In Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 2, you'll read about a branch or a root, and it speaks about, at the time it's speaking about God and His working through the nation of Israel. Jeremiah 23 verses 5 and following speaks something similar, though a little bit different. And it seems to me what's in view is that the nation is in view, but since it's this root, or since it's this branch, it grows up ultimately into Christ. And in Revelation 12, when this child is born, it's speaking of the righteous remnant. The first wonder is the woman who stands for the righteous remnant, and she brings forth a child, the child then being Christ, who comes forth out of the righteous people of the Old Testament, out of the nation of Israel. But then it later becomes, look at this in 12:13, when the dragon saw that he was cast into the earth, he persecuted the woman which had brought forth the man-child. Later on in this section, it's now talking about the church. So how can the motif shift from being the Old Testament Israeli people to being the New Testament people, the New Testament church? Well, it seems that in both cases, the righteous remnant is in view. If you were to put a label on it, the woman is the righteous remnant. She brings forth the Christ, and then the dragon, Satan, works in this conflict through Rome. We see some very apocalyptic language. If you take a look at 12:5, some of this sounds a lot like the Edenic scene, and we reminisce on Genesis chapters 1 through 3. But it says in verse 5, "She brought forth a man-child, Christ, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron." And that is an echo of Psalm 2, 8 and 9. And it says, "And her child was caught up unto God and to His throne." And it says, "The woman fled into the wilderness," and this is quite like in Egypt, where when the oppressor rises up, Pharaoh, where do they flee? They flee over the sea, and they go into the wilderness. And so in verse 6 it says, "Where she had a place prepared of God," it's a place of rest, and they're going to be fed for that 42 months, 3.5 years, 3.5 days, the time of the dividing of a times, or as it says here, 1,260 days. And it says in 7, "There was war in heaven." We'll come back to that in just a moment. But it says, "Michael and his angels," and you can picture them on one side, "fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. And they prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out." It even identifies who the dragon is for us explicitly. He's that old serpent, that one in Genesis 3. He's Satan, which deceives the whole world, and was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. What's going on in 12, 5 through 9? Is this a scene that we ought to look for before the creation of the world? No, no. That it takes place in heaven is just another part of the vision, it would seem. It's a conflict. And if we divide up the sides, look who it is between. It's between God and Satan, ultimately. It's God that Satan's trying to attack. And Satan knows, look at this verse. I know I'm skipping down a little bit further. But it says in verse 12, because he knows that he hath but a short time. Satan's trying to do all that he can in this period that he's been given. And so he's doing what he can in the time allotted in order to try to get at God. So the conflict is between God, the righteous, and Satan, the wicked. But they don't work personally. We don't see some battle where Satan, with a body, comes against God with a body. What we're seeing is a war between Satan and God, and it's the same kind, not the same, but it's the same kind of conflict that still on goes with the Church of Christ against Satan today. Well, who are we fighting against? Well, it's not necessarily against Satan. You can't go out and take a sword and say we're going to attack this figure because that's what God desires. And so who do we fight against? The forces of wickedness. We fight against sin. We fight against immorality. That's the same conflict, the same kind of conflict that's going on in Revelation 12. So it's between the woman and the dragon. It's between Michael. Look at this text again in 7. The war is between Michael and his angels and the dragon and his angels. But ultimately, what are we seeing? We're seeing in the vision a battle between Michael and God and Christ and the saints against Satan, the dragon, and the angels that follow him. Ultimately, this is one of those things where these forces are working through mediums. This is God and Satan having their battle out. But it's through the medium of Rome and the saints. You remember another case in the Old Testament where God gets into it with Satan, and they have their own kind of battle there as well. But it's not between God and Satan personally, but they work through Job and his friends. The battle there between Job and his friends is still a battle between God and Satan. But they're simply using these other individuals to play that out in the scheme of things. The same thing is in Revelation 12, 5 through 9. The battle is, in this world, it's between Rome and the saints. But ultimately, when you look at who it is that's going to war against God, it's Satan's doing. We're seeing a grand scene of that in 12, 5 through 9. So it doesn't go back to the scene of Eden. It's not before the foundation of the world. This is not when the angels fall from heaven. This is simply the battle between the saints and Rome. In 10 through 17, we have the defeat of the dragon. Watch what is stated. It says in verse 10, the saints are hearing this voice. John hears this voice. Now is come salvation. For salvation from what? Sin? No, they've already been redeemed from sin. So said 7, 13, and 14. But the salvation here is from Rome. It's a physical redemption. And strength. And the reign. The word is basileia in the Greek. It's the same word we saw in 5:10, and we dealt with it there. Same word we saw in 11:15, and we worked with it there. It's the reign, or it's the kingdom. And so in 12:10, he says the kingdom of our God. He's not saying that the kingdom hadn't yet come. He's saying that the kingdom is being vindicated. That truth, that God reigns, is going to be expressed publicly, demonstrated publicly over the fall of Rome. And so in 12:11, they overcame by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony, they loved not their lives unto the death. 12:12 is pivotal, and we've talked about it once before. But the heaven dwellers, look at this. It explicitly says, therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you that dwell in them. And then it pits that against the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea. And we've already seen the angel standing upon both of those places in 10 verse 2. So when we see this picture of the saints making these kinds of declarations, we've overcome by the blood of the Lamb. And then the statement is given, you rejoice, heaven dwellers, and those of you that dwell in the earth and the sea, you don't have an opportunity to rejoice because the devil has come down unto you. He has great wrath, and he's working through Rome, knowing that he's limited for a very short time. In 14, we're skipping over 13, he says in 14, the woman received 2 wings of a great eagle. And this echoes that text in Exodus 19:4. Where the people cross out of the sea, they cross over the sea, and they go through the wilderness, and God gives them rest from the oppressor, from Pharaoh. And it says that they fled into the wilderness as though it were on the wings of a great eagle. That's what John's getting at. He's getting at that Exodus motif once more. And it says they were nourished for a time, times and half a time. And watch what the serpent does. We see this picture. This is a very image-based book. And he says in 15, the serpent, the devil, Satan, he knows that he's limited. And so he casts out of his mouth, you can see, if you will, the snake, the serpent. And out of his mouth comes this great flood. And he's trying to cause the woman to be carried away. He's trying to attack the righteous remnant of God. But in verse 16, in the same way that think about this. When the Israeli people reached water, it looked like it posed a serious threat to their existence. And then God says, Moses, part the sea. And the conflict is resolved. In that same way, the devil tries to thwart God's people with water once more, and he throws this flood at them. And when the water comes against God's people, he says it's not a problem. And in verse 16, the earth helps the woman. The earth helps the righteous remnant, and swallows up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And just as the flood is about to wash all of the saints away, in the vision, the earth takes care of the thing. God helps them out. And in verse 17, the dragon is wroth. He's angry. And so he goes to war once more with the remnant of her seed, speaking of the saints, speaking of the New Testament saints, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Christ. In 13:1 now, we start to see who is the villain. We've heard a little bit here or there. We've heard in Revelation 11, verse 7, about the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. We've heard now something in chapter 12 about the dragon. But we enter now into 13, where we really start to see John picturing who is the beast. In 13:1, it says, I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea. And notice about this beast. It has 7 heads, 10 horns, and upon these horns 10 crowns, and upon the heads the name of blasphemy. 2 is important. Watch 2. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth was as that of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Try to put that image in your mind for just a brief moment. And turn with me to Daniel chapter 7. The similarity is not coincidental. John is intentionally drawing our minds back to this Old Testament text. And there's a reason for that. Daniel chapter 7 is the echo. He says in 7:3, there were 4 beasts. And he says in 4, the first one was like a lion. He says in verse 5, the second was like unto a bear. He says in verse 6, the third, another, like a leopard. And then in 7 and 8, after this I saw, Daniel says, in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth, it devoured and brake in pieces, and it stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Let's stop here for just a moment after we read verse 24. What are these 10 horns? It says in 7:24, the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them. If you've got 10 plus 1, how many do you have? You've got 11. Daniel sees 11 horns. Go back to Revelation now and take a look at 17. John sees a later picture of this beast, and 13 and 17 are both descriptions of the same beast. And we'll see that when we get to 17. But in 17, keep in mind, Daniel saw 11 horns, and we just read the text in 7:24 where he said, these horns are 10 kings, and another shall rise after them. Now watch what John says in Revelation 17 and verse 9. Here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are 7 kings. He says in verse 11, the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth, and is of the seven, and goes into perdition. Okay, jump back to 13, and I'll try to tie all of this together in the most understandable way. In 13 and verse 3, he says, I saw one of his heads. How many are there on the beast? There are 7. John sees a 7-headed beast. And it says one of these heads was wounded to death. Incidentally, that is the same word in the Greek as in 5:6, where it talks about the slain lamb. And so one of these heads takes on the same, it's a parody of Christ and his work, where he is slain. One of these 7 heads, you can almost imagine something out of like Greek imagery, where one of the heads of the beast is cut off, leaving it with 6. And watch what happens. But the deadly wound was healed. One of the heads grows up to take its place. So ultimately, we look at this beast, and we can see this beast coming up out of the sea. It has 7 heads. One of the heads gets cut off, but then another head arises to leave it with 7 again. What's going on here? Look at the PowerPoint with me for just a moment. Daniel sees 11 horns. John sees 8 heads. Daniel said, I saw 10 horns, and another arose. John says he saw 7 heads, but then another comes up to take the place of the one that's wounded. Both horns, Daniel 7:24, and the heads, Revelation 17:10, equal kings. Both of them say that. So there's not a big difference to be made about why does Daniel see horns where John sees heads? Doesn't matter. They both come out and tell us. Daniel says in 7:24, when I saw horns, I saw kings. John says, when I saw heads, I saw kings. So both of the figures equal kings. And so the difference in the figures is minor. Here's what I think is going on. If you were to ask Daniel, what do you mean by these 10 plus 1? He's going to tell you he's seeing the Roman kings. In Daniel's view, he has the 10 plus 1. And he starts with Augustus, the first Roman Caesar. And he says Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius then stand up and try to take place as the ruler. They don't succeed. And then you have Vespasian who comes along. And then Titus, leaving us with the 11th, the little horn of Daniel 7, which is Domitian, the Roman emperor. In John's view, he sees 8 heads. The 7 initial heads would have been Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, since they were not emperors. And think about when John is writing, these individuals, if he's writing after the reigns of Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who were just those upstart generals and didn't succeed, it would make perfect sense for John not to include them as emperors. He's looked ahead, or he's looked behind, and he's said, these guys weren't emperors. They didn't reign. They didn't rule over Rome. They tried, but they didn't succeed. So while Daniel sees the 11, John sees 8. And both of those end up with Domitian, the little horn of Daniel 7, and the beast, the 8th head of the beast of Revelation 13. It all lands on Domitian, it seems to me. You might need to read some of the secular histories in order to say this sounds plausible. I assure you I'm not just bolstering my view with spotty research. When we look at 13:3 and 4, there was a myth that came about, and you can read of this in the secular histories. It was called the Nero Redivivus myth. And what it was is when Nero died, and I've talked a little bit about this already, when Nero died, the people couldn't believe it. He had committed suicide, and the people said, we don't buy into that. Nero's still alive. He's fled to the Parthian land. Or maybe he's coming back with another army and he's going to come at Rome again. But the people wouldn't buy into Nero's death. And so this myth circulated that Nero hadn't really died. Nonsense. He was dead. They even had a funeral for him right there in the Roman city. But in Revelation 13:3 and 4, John, it seems, takes this myth that was apparently well known at the time, indicating that if Nero's already dead, it indicates probably a little bit of a later dating of the book than during the days of Nero. And it says, I saw one of his heads, verse 3, as it were wounded to death. Nero is the head, it seems to me, who started the persecution of the saints. Nero flares up this persecution of God's people, and he dies. And so another head stands up to take his place. Who's the next persecuting emperor within the Roman state? It's Domitian. And Domitian is this eighth head that comes up. The world wonders after this beast. And they worshipped in 13:4 the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. Satan being the one who's saying, Rome is my tool, Rome is my agent, the beast is my agent. And they worshipped the beast, and notice their claim, who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him? This is the same question that's asked in Exodus 15, verse 11. After the crossing of the Red Sea, the people of Israel come out of the land of Egypt, and they make the declaration, Moses makes the declaration, this is Jehovah God, who is able to war with him, who is like unto him, speaking of God. Well, the Roman people, it seems, make the same kind of claim about their emperor Domitian, who's forcing them at this time to declare, Caesar is Lord. In 13:5 it says, there was given unto him a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. 13:7, it was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. Some of this phraseology is remarkably similar to that of Daniel chapter 7. Let me just grab this text, and if you can turn there quickly, you can read along. We just read about him speaking great things. The persecution lasts that time, times and half a times. He's speaking blasphemy. He's changing times and laws. He's warring against the saints. Look at what the work of the 11th horn in Daniel 7 is. Look at what his work is. It says in 7:24, the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings, and I think that is Augustus through Titus. And it says in 24, another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first. Speaking of Domitian, it seems. And in verse 25, he will speak great words against the Most High. Sounds like Revelation 13:5 and 6. It says, and he will wear out the saints of the Most High. Sounds like Revelation 13:6 and 7. And he'll think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of a time. His work is the persecution of God's people. Who's doing it? The 11th horn in Daniel's vision, the 8th head in John's. It's the work of the 8th Roman emperor, the 11th in Daniel's chronology of Domitian. When we look at Revelation 13 then, it seems to me that one of these, we've talked about this. Domitian then, the 8th Roman emperor, we gave this in our historical sketch at the very, very, very start of our series. Domitian was the one who forced emperor worship. He forced the people in the provinces to take the pinch of incense and cast it into the fire and say, Caesar is Lord. He was the one who declared himself alive as God, the first Roman emperor ever to do that. Some of them had declared their deity, but it was after their death. So the Senate said, aha, Augustus is dead. Let's worship him as God. And the imperial cult enforced that. But none of them ever declared themselves to be deity while they were living. Domitian did. He was the first. He was the one who made war against the saints. He parallels Daniel's 11th horn, and he did persecute the saints for a time, times, and a half a times. We move now into 13:11, and there's a second beast that comes up. It says in 13:11, I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. So we've already seen the sea beast, and now we see the earth or the land beast. And he has 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Watch what his work is. If you were to ask the earth beast, what is your purpose? He says this, I am here to exercise, verse 12, the power of the first beast before him, and to cause the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. This seems to me to be a clear reference to the imperial cult, whose entire purpose, as it's found in Domitian, was to promote the work of Domitian as emperor, to promote the work of Rome. The imperial cult is the strong arm of Rome, and they're the ones out there saying throughout the provinces, throughout the known world, you must, once a year, take the incense and pour it into the fire, pitch it into the fire, and say Caesar is Lord, else what happens? They don't bear the approval of the Roman state. Well, what happens if you don't have the state on your side? What happens if Rome doesn't side up with you? Well, in the vision, watch what it says. I'm jumping ahead just a moment here. But it says in 15, he, this earth beast, had the power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast, those should be killed. And watch what he gives them. It says in 16, he causes all of them, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, anybody at this time, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. If you don't follow after Rome and worship them, you don't receive the approval, the mark, the seal of the beast. If the beast is Rome, then the seal is somehow pertaining to Rome. And I contend strongly that it is. It's all about Rome. And so what happens is the Roman Senate has set up a scenario, a situation. They set up a conflict where anybody who won't worship Caesar as Lord cannot bear the approval of Rome. Well, what does that mean for the saints? They're not going to be saying Caesar is Lord. They're not going to be able to, watch what 17 says. If you don't have the mark of the beast, it says no man might buy or sell, except he has the mark of the beast, the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Now, we'll work with that here in just a moment about what this is. But notice in 13 and verse 12 that this work is to exercise the power of the first beast. Later on, you're going to see, and I've got the references here on the PowerPoint, it's 16:13 and 19:20. From this point forward, you don't hear anything more about the earth beast, but he's later called the false prophet. In 16:13 it says, I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. This was his work, to prophesy falsely in favor of, to exercise the power of the first beast, the sea beast. In Revelation chapter 19 and verse 20, we're going to see a judgment scene there. Notice who it is. The beast was taken, the sea beast, it's Rome, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles. That's the land or the earth beast. Jump back to 13 now. He says in 13, the one that works false miracles, the false prophet that works those false miracles. In 13:14, talking about that land beast, it says he deceives them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles. From this point forward, we will hear about the land beast as being the false prophet. His work is to promote Rome, the sea beast. So what you have is a scenario, you have a situation where the sea beast, Rome, needs to enforce its rule throughout the provinces. How do they do it? They use the imperial cult. They use this wicked cult that's enforcing upon everybody, worship the beast, buy into Rome as God, say Caesar is Lord, and denounce Jehovah God. That's the situation that's surrounding the saints. We run now into 18, the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast is associated with the Roman beast and the imperial cult. But there are some strange things going on. The first one is, should we understand this mark to be visionary, only within the vision, or is it a literal thing? Well, I can't quite say, but I do think there's some food for thought here. In 7, we see the seal of God, the mark of God. Is it a literal thing? No. No, remember he says, seal the 144,000. Is that literal? No, it's in the vision. It's in the vision. So it could be the case, it might be the case, it may be probable that it's the case, that in 18 when it says there's a mark of the beast, maybe it's only a vehicle of the vision. Maybe it's in the vision and it's not a literal thing. On the other hand, maybe it is a literal thing. Some have alleged that it was official papers, that when you took your incense and you put it into the fire, some scholars think that what's going on is at that point, and there's some archaeological evidence that this was the case, though it may not be what John has in mind when he talks about the mark of the beast. That this was going on, I'm sure of. That it's what John has in view here, I'm not. Now, in 13, 17, and 18, it may be the case that they were granted official papers from the Roman state. But maybe John's saying, yeah, I understand that. That's not necessarily what I'm conveying in 13, 17, 13, 18. Maybe John's just saying it's all a point of the vision. What about this word I have up here called gematria? What is that? This is where you take a letter and you ascribe to it a numerical value. If I were to draw on a piece of paper and I drew the letter V, how much would you think that's worth? 5. We're familiar with Roman numerals. What if I drew X? 10. What about L? 50. Gematria was this term, and you can read it elsewhere. It's not just in what I'm about to propose. There were a couple of other places. For instance, in the Sibylline Oracles, another writing, not scripture, but another writing of that time, there was a notation about 888, the number 888, and it refers to Christ. How that is? By ascribing some kind of numerical value to these numbers. There was also an etching on one of the columns in one of the Roman cities, and it said, "I love her whose number is 545." Don't know. Who is that? Gematria is this process, and the Jews used it. It may be the case that if we ascribe in the Hebrew language for the letter D, the number may be 4. Actually, let's get this, just to help maybe understand the argument. Take a look at Matthew 1. I don't want to say that I'm confident on this point, but I do want to bring it to your minds. In Matthew chapter 1 and verse 17, he says 3 times there are 14 generations. He says in 1:17, the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. He says from David unto the carrying away of Babylon, 14 generations. And he says in 17, from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ, 14 generations. Did Matthew bomb when he said there are 14 from David unto Babylon? This raises a serious question because in 1 verse 8, he goes immediately and he says, Asa begat Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat begat Jehoram, and Jehoram begat Uzzias. But it's interesting that between Jehoram and Uzzias, he left out Athaliah, Joash, and Amaziah. Did Matthew make a mistake when he said there were 14, and did he accidentally omit 3? It may be the case that what he's using is this tool of gematria to call to our minds for the sake of memorization or some other reason, 14, 14, and 14. And what might be significant about 14? If you give the letter D, as the Hebrews did, the numerical value of 4, and you give the letter W, the numerical value of 6, and you add all that up, DWD, as would be David's name in the Hebrew language, would come out to 14. Is that a sound argument? I can't quite say. But that the Jews used this literary tool, gematria, I'm sure of. Maybe that's what's going on with Nero Caesar in Revelation chapter 13. When we look back to the number then in 13:18, and he says, here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast. It is the number of a man. And he tells us his number as 666. 666. It is very interesting, I've got it on the PowerPoint here, that Nero Caesar, Neron Kaiser, as it would have been transliterated in the Hebrew, from the Hebrew, equals out per their numerology to 666. Interestingly enough, there are a couple of variations in the manuscripts. There are a couple of manuscripts that don't give the number 666. But instead, it gives us the number 616. Bruce Metzger, a world-renowned textual critic, says that there's some plausibility here for seeing the number as 616. Well, is there a name that fits 616? Interestingly enough, there are some places where Nero's last N is cut off, just leaving it with Nero Kaiser. And if you delete that from the name, it becomes 616, the letter N being given the numerology of 50. Nero, it seems, in both cases would be the one in view. But maybe that's not necessarily what we should go for either. Maybe all of that is much too speculative. You have the right to think that. I have the right to think that. But maybe we should read it this way. Look at it in 13:18. Maybe he's not looking at a specific individual. Maybe he's not trying to get us to zone in on all of these cryptic references. But maybe we should read it this way. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of man. It is a non-divine number. It is just simply the number that demonstrates deity is not the Roman state. God is not within the Roman state. This is the number of a mere mortal. And maybe that's what is in view. He's not looking at Nero specifically, but maybe he's just saying, Domitian, the beast, the one that's raised up against the saints, he's not God. He's not divine. We move now into 14. What's the mark of the beast then? It seems to me that it's talking about some kind of association, whether literal or maybe it's just in the vision, where they align themselves with the Roman state. In 14:1, then, we see this scene, and it says, I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000. And watch what's described of them. In verse 1, they have their father's name written in their foreheads. Literally? Well, no, but this is in the vision. Look at what's said in verse 3. Here they once again sing that new song. We'll see some more new things surface in the text in a moment. They sing this new song in reminiscence of Isaiah 42. And it says that they were, at the end of verse 3, redeemed from the earth. It says in verse 4 that this 144,000 group, it says that they were not defiled with women, that they were virgins, that they follow the Lamb, that they were redeemed from men, that they were the firstfruits unto God and unto the Lamb. And it says in verse 5 that these 144,000, in their mouth, no guile. And it says that they are without fault before the throne of God. When you pair this with the other scene of the 144,000 in Revelation 7, where the question is asked in 6:17, who will be able to stand in the impending judgment upon Rome, the answer is the righteous. The 144,000 in both scenes represent the righteous. That's who will be able to stand when God judges. But then what about this if we take it in a literal way? Interestingly enough, Hal Lindsey in his book, There's a New World Coming, and this is still largely the popular view among denominationalism, we should understand this language literally. He says that the 144,000 is a literal number. That the Jews, they're all Jews, remember, from 1 through 8. They're all the 12,000 from the Jewish tribes. He says that they are a literal number. He says that all of these things are literal, but when he approaches 14:4 where it says they are virgins, he says it's figurative. Inconsistent. It's very inconsistent. I contend, and rightfully so, that all of these things are figures. When he says that they are virgins, when he says that they've been redeemed from men, when he says that they are Jews, when he says that the number is 144,000, all of these things, along with the rest of the book of Revelation, are figures. And so he's saying for us, if we pair it with chapter 7, when the question is asked who will be able to stand, it's all coming together to picture a symbol of the righteous, the faithful, the saints. We move now forward, and these angels come, 4 of them, or one angel with 4 messages. Four angels with 4 messages, I mean. And it says in 6, I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having, there's no definite article here. I don't know how your text reads. The King James has the word the. It's not there in the Greek. It should just read, and I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having everlasting good news to preach unto them. What's the good news? It tells us what that good news is in verse 7. He's telling the saints, the angel's coming with a piece of good tidings. And he says in verse 7, here's your good news. Fear God. Give glory to Him. The hour of His judgment has come. Rome is going to fall. And so the good news is that Rome is not going to remain. Rome is going down. And he says that in 14:8. There's a second message. Another angel follows and says another piece of this good news. Babylon is fallen. And he echoes Isaiah 21:9 and 10. He even says it's that great city. Look, whoever we identify Babylon as, if we understand it to be Jerusalem, it's in the past. If we understand it to be Rome, it's in the past. The only way to make these things about our future is to deny the time statements of the book, and then to say in 14 and verse 8, Babylon must be some city in our time. It's not. It refers to Rome. This raises some serious difficulty in 10 and 11. We'll get there in just a moment. But in 14:9, a third angel follows. So the first one said, fear God, give glory to Him, the hour of His judgment has come. The second said, Babylon is fallen. The third says now in verse 9, don't worship the beast and his image. And then we have in verses 10 and 11 another part to his declaration. In 14:10, this third angel says this as well, and this becomes very tricky. I'll need you to follow along in the Old Testament text that I'll hand out here in just a moment. But he says, "The same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God." I'm getting a little off of my PowerPoint. Sorry about that. He says in 14:10 and 11, here we go. "The same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascends up forever and ever. And they have no rest day nor night, who worship the image and the beast and his image, and whosoever receives the mark of his name." The end of verse 11 really helps us see this is not final judgment. This is about a judgment upon Rome. But then this begs the question, how can we understand this tormenting with fire and brimstone and the ascending smoke that goes up forever and ever? How can we understand these as only being a judgment upon Rome? Well, it's what's happening in the vision. It's what John sees. If you ask John what he saw, he's seeing this smoke. He's seeing a valley of smoke, and he's seeing Babylon going up in flames, and they're tormented for eternity in the vision. But once again, we are in the vision. Take a look at Isaiah chapter 34. Hold your finger at Revelation 14. And we need to get this Old Testament reference. We read it when it talks about the rolling up of the heavens and the earth as a scroll in 34:4. But once again, I'll call your mind to the points in verse 5, chapter 34 of Isaiah, verse 5, where he says this is a judgment upon Idumea, Edom. He says in 34:8, this day of judgment upon Edom, he says it again in verse 6, it's a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. But he says in 34:8, it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, and the year of recompenses for the controversy of Zion. And he says in verse 9, the streams thereof, the streams in the land of Edom, in this vision that Isaiah is seeing, in this apocalyptic scene, will be turned into pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone, and the land will become burning pitch. And watch what is expressed at the fall of Edom in verse 10. It will not be quenched night nor day. The smoke thereof shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. None shall pass through it forever and ever. When you look at Isaiah 34, what he's saying is the judgment of Edom is irrevocable. It will not be pulled back. Edom's going down and it will never recover. If we go back to Revelation 14, it's that same language. He's echoing Isaiah 34, where he's saying the same kind of thing, and he's seeing the same thing in the vision. Fire and brimstone and ascending smoke forever and ever. What John is saying, this is irrevocable judgment. Rome will never recover. Now, this is another interesting point, and this might help us to appreciate the fact that this is not the final judgment scene. In 14:10, notice where this judgment occurs. He shall be, 14:10b, he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the vision, in the presence of the angels and in the presence of the Lamb. I need us at this point to get 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, where Paul writes, it seems to me, about the final judgment. And notice what is said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verses 8 and 9. He says in 2 Thessalonians 1:8, there's a day coming where flaming fire will take vengeance on those who know not God and on those who obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's my studious opinion that this is in our future, that this has not yet happened. But he says in 1:9, regarding that day, that sometime in the future, in our future, that they will be punished, the wicked will be punished, those who obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ will be punished with everlasting destruction from or out of the presence of the Lord. And when we compare that judgment scene in 2 Thessalonians 1, where it's not in the presence of the Lamb, not in the presence of the Lord, and we pair that with Revelation 14:10, where it says, this judgment is in the presence of the Lord, it seems to me they cannot both be the same judgment. It seems to me we ought to understand Revelation 14:10 and 11 as a visionary scene, as one upon Rome in the vision. And that's what John's seeing. And it's in the presence of the Lamb. But the judgment scene that remains in our future is one that is out of the presence of the Lamb. And there's an evident contradiction if we understand both to speak of the same thing. I'm going to actually move back on a slide. The fourth message is this: the dead in Christ are blessed. Specifically, he's telling about the blessings that are to come to those who die in the Roman persecution. But let me express this. You might be feeling that I've reserved most of the book unto the Roman time frame, and I think that's how we ought to view it. But these timeless truths that we're picking up on along the way are as applicable today as they were back then. Look, even though that he's got a message for the New Testament in the first century, John is still saying these timeless truths to us. It is still as true now as it was back then. If you die in the Lord, you're blessed. And that's what he's saying in 14:13. It's still as true as it was back then. The leaders of this world, may it be our president or our kings today, President Donald Trump is not God. And so we see these messages, even though he's got his historical reference as Rome, these timeless truths still replay themselves in our own time. He's not talking about Donald Trump. He's talking about Rome. But the truth that we take away from this, the timeless truth, the principle, is as true now as it ever was. And that's an application rather than a fulfillment of the vision. We now move into 14, verses 14 through 20, where we see the harvest scene as a scene of judgment. And I'm going to have to move quickly through this section. He says in 14, I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a drepanon, a scythe, a sickle, one that is a tool for cutting down the wheat and initiating a harvest. And it says in 14:14, he's riding in upon the cloud. He's coming. It's the Son of Man. Let's look at 1:7 once more. If we follow the context of the book, and I argued my case on 1:7, though it may be tough to appreciate right out of the gate. And what I mean by that is in 1:7, for me to say this isn't the second coming might all of a sudden sound very bizarre. But when we get to 14:14, and we're seeing that this is judgment upon Rome, and we see another scene where the Son of Man rides in on a cloud, and he comes in wearing a crown, and he comes in with a drepanon, a sharp sickle, a scythe, and he's ready to execute judgment, a harvest. We look at Revelation 1:7, and we reminisce on the language that starts the book. Behold, saints, don't fear Rome, don't fear Domitian. Your Lord, he's coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth will wail because of him. What 14:14 is picturing is this judgment coming in the reminiscence of Micah 1, Isaiah 19:1, and other passages, where the Lord comes in upon a cloud and says, I will judge you. This is not going to be Rome's time for victory. Rome is falling. We need to get this passage to appreciate the figure. Take a look at Jeremiah 51:33. I'll make the point later, I believe, if it's in my PowerPoint. I'll make the point that Jeremiah 50 and 51 is the basis for the judgment of Babylon. Jeremiah is a prophet speaking about 6th century BC Judah. And in Jeremiah 50 and 51, he gives us the lengthiest discourse about the fall of physical Babylon. In Jeremiah 51:33, he's talking about Babylon's fall. Well, look at 8. Look at 51:8. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Seems clear enough. Verse 9, we would have healed Babylon, but she's not going to heal. Verse 12, set up the standard upon the walls of Babylon. You can read this sort of thing all throughout the text. Look at 51:33. What does the prophet call the fall of Babylon back into the Old Testament? He says in 51:33, thus saith the Lord and Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the daughter of Babylon is like a threshing floor. This is where they beat the wheat. This is where they initiated the harvest. They brought the grain, they brought the wheat, and they laid it there, and this is where they would thresh the thing. And it says, it is a time to thresh her, yet a little while, and the time of her harvest shall come. Speaking of the fall of Babylon. When we go back to the book of Revelation, and we see in 14:14, our Lord riding in upon a cloud, and he comes in with the scythe. And it says in 15, thrust in thy sickle, and reap. The time is come for thee to reap. The harvest of the earth is ripe. He's talking about a harvest upon Babylon. The question then remains is, who is Babylon? It seems to me it's Rome. And we read in verse 17, at this point, an angel comes out of heaven, and he has a sharp sickle. And another angel, verse 18, cries with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, and said, thrust in your sharp sickle, the scythe, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth. We're not only going to have a harvest of the things, we're also going to have the grapes brought to the winepress and trodden down. And it says, because in verse 18, the end of it, her grapes are fully ripe. The angel does the thing, and in verse 20, the winepress, which is without the city, it says that they trod upon the grapes, and blood came out of the winepress, came out of the vat, even unto the horse bridles by the space of 1,600 furlongs. All of this is in the image, where we see two different pictures. The first one being of the Lord coming in upon a cloud, and he takes the scythe and he threshes the wheat. The second is one where the winepress is outside of the camp, outside of the city, and all of the grapes, picturing Rome, are in this thing, and they start to squash them. They start to stomp on them. And you can see this sort of thing back into the Old Testament. I'm thinking of the book of Judges, where there's a text, and I think it's Judges 6, about their stomping of the grapes at the winepress in order to get the juice out of the grapes. And they picture this as a judgment upon Rome. It's taken from Joel 3, which is a very complex text, but the text is drawn from Joel 3 about some kind of judgment scene upon the wicked. It's applied here to the fall of Rome. Well, what happens? In 15, we move forward. And what happens is there's another sign in heaven. 7 angels have 7 plagues. And in these angels is filled up the wrath of God. The wrath of God upon whom? The wrath of God upon Rome. And it says, I saw a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, and they stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. I'm just going to read this section off my PowerPoint. It says that the Egypt motif is used. The blood of saints is transformed into an heavenly Red Sea. Plagues are cast upon Egypt, as she is so called in 11 verse 8. And her oppressor, the Pharaoh, Domitian in this framework, is imaged in the beast. And you can see some of that in those Old Testament texts, Isaiah 51 and Ezekiel 29:3. What the saints then do, if you look at 15:2, is they cross the sea, just as they did in the Egypt account, and they move forward. And verse 3, as in Exodus 15, they sing the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb. It's a victory hymn. They sing, God has brought victory to us. And so then, they sing this new song, and we start to see in 15, I'm going to have to skip through some of that. We see God's presence in His temple. 15:8 says the temple was filled with smoke. They sing praises before God. They say the victory belongs to you. And no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. What we've seen today, this morning, in chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15, we have seen an interlude. We have seen a break. In chapters 6 and 7, we saw the 7 seals opened. And at the opening of that 7th seal in 8 verse 1, it unleashes 7 trumpets, the next section of the vision. At the sounding of the 7th trumpet, 11:15, it unleashes the 7 vials of God's wrath. All of this is a perfect thing. The 7 just being a symbol of perfection. And so we start to see now in 16 the 7 vials of God's wrath. What does it picture? We've seen the partial judgment of Rome where He's trying to get them to repent. But now the full thing is imaged. In 16:1, we've got a couple of minutes and I think we'll be okay. 16:1 through, I'm just going to abbreviate this very quickly. 16:1 through 12 is the exact same as the 7 trumpets. In chapter 8, verse 7, that's where that section begins. But there's this absence in 16:1 through 12, the third part. The judgment is no longer upon the third part. The judgment is no longer in hopes that Rome repents. Now it's just the full judgment. And so it says in 16:2, the first vial is poured out upon the earth, and there falls this noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast. The second angel is poured out, and it's as blood of a dead man. Every living soul dies in the sea. The third angel, what happens? He pours out his vial upon the rivers and the fountains of water. I won't read the rest of up through verse 12. But the angels that blow the trumpets in 8:1 through 9:21, when you see a judgment upon the sea or a judgment upon the grass and the trees and that sort of thing, it corresponds perfectly to the judgments that take place in 16. The only difference is that this time it's not a partial judgment. This time it's the full thing. Rome's getting the full blast. In 5 through 7, the judgment, notice this, is upon those who have shed the blood of the saints and the prophets. If we believe that the miraculous gifts have ceased, it seems to me we ought to favor the interpretation that the prophets must speak of a first century judgment. The miraculous gifts would have to be operative. The oppressor was one who killed those who were endowed with the Holy Spirit of God in a miraculous way. If you take a look at Revelation 18 very quickly, Revelation 18, we see another kind of remark where he says in 18:20, "Rejoice over her, the fallen city of Babylon," whoever she may be, I contend it's Rome, "thou heaven, and you apostles and prophets, God has avenged you on her." Whoever the oppressor was one who lived during the time of the miraculous gifts. It must be Rome. It cannot be the Roman Catholic Church, who existed about 600 years later. And so he says, God has avenged you on the individual who slayed the apostles and the prophets. When we look at 19:19, I'm going to look at this very quickly. 19:19, he sees the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but what he's picturing once again is the same battle as in 13 through 21. And this is where we discuss the Battle of Armageddon. I'll take one more minute if you don't mind. In 13, 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast. If that's Rome, the Battle of Armageddon cannot be extended past Rome's time frame. And then he says, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, if that's the imperial cult, the one who exercises the power of the beast and pays homage to his name, to Rome. If that's it, then this Battle of Armageddon that we're about to see cannot be in our future. He says in 14, the battle of the great day of the God of Almighty is about to happen. They gather together an army against God, and then in 16:15, Christ says, look, don't worry about Rome. I'm coming as a thief. I'm coming in a surprise. And he says in 16, they were gathered into a place called in the Hebrew tongue, Harmageddon, which means the Mount of Megiddo, and you can read about it in several places in the Old Testament. It is in the Old Testament. Don't let these individuals tell you differently when they act like the Battle of Armageddon is something that's only in the future. This is where King Josiah lost a battle because he went against God's plan, and where even a heathen king like Cyrus or Pharaoh Necho could succeed. And if even Pharaoh Necho could succeed because it was God's bidding, it just demonstrates a scene of victory. The 7th angel, 17, says, poured his vial out into the air. There came a great voice, and notice what the voice says. It is done. What is done? The full judgment of Rome. There's not much of a battle. You don't see anything about this grand battle that plays out, where the hero rides in and executes this great victory. It ends. It almost seems like John gets to the climax of the vision, and it just stops. What we're about to see in this next last hour is the obituary of the Roman state. In 17 through 22, we'll get all of those gory details that we didn't get in the Battle of Armageddon. We'll start to see more of that in 17 through 22, where a comment is given on Rome's fall. Thank you for your kind attention.